Welcome to episode 6 of Getting Started with Win2D. I know this video is pretty late, but I've been extremely busy with real life stuff. In episode 6, we are going to program a input manager such that the scene can receive inputs from the keyboard and mouse so it can act accordingly. Now, first thing I want to do is to review what we have done so far, and the best way I can achieve that is to show a picture of the current game engine as it stands. Now let's check out the game engine right now. As you can see, we have a game loop, which is represented by this black rectangle, and each time to the game loop we figure out the delta time since the last time it has been called, and then we ask the screen manager what is the current scene, and then we call update on that scene, and which will pass the delta time into that update function, which in turn calls update on all of the scene items. Now after that is done, we check to see if a draw should happen based off the required FPS that we set in the game timer. Now if enough time has passed, we we ask the scene manager what's the current scene again, and then we call draw on it, which in turns call draw on all the scene items, and then we get a nice moving entity on the screen, right? So we got figure out a way to incorporate input manager into this very simple game engine, and this is what we're trying to accomplish today. So in the next picture you'll see the full effect. This is the game engine that we are trying to program today, and it looks very similar to the previous picture, because all it has extra is this input manager. And as you can see, that the keyboard and mouse is actually outside this gaming loop, because it's it can be added anytime. So if an action happens on the keyboard or the mouse, we add it to the input manager as an input item, which we have to code up ourselves as well. So looking through this game loop, we have each time the game loop has passed, we figure out the delta time, and we pop the very first input out of the queue, and then we ask the screen manager what is the current scene, and then we pass the delta time and the input item onto the scene, which then calls update on all the scene items with the input item as well. And of course, after that is done, it determines if we need to draw the current scene. So that is the whole aspect of this very simple gaming engine that I think everybody should be able to understand and program themselves before moving on to more advanced stuff. And what I can tell you now, since I've been doing this for a good 20 years, is if you can do something like this, understand it, you can work at almost any tech company that you want. Now we're doing this from scratch, and we're just using Win2D as a mechanism just to get stuff on the screen. Okay, so the first thing we have to do, let's look at this picture here, and the first thing we have to do is create an input manager, and then we have to define a input item. So these are all generic, and we have done a lot of managers in this series, like the scene manager here. So let's just copy that as a template, and but the big difference is the input items are coming from the user here. So you have to lock the instance, and if you gone through programming, a computer science program, or have done this in the past, when you have multiple inputs that can happen at the same time, you might have a threading issue. So, and if you have a collection that is not thread safe, you have to lock the collection, insert it, and unlock it. And in programming terms, it's either a mutex or a semaphore, but in C# it's just we're just going to use something called lock. Okay, so let's get started here. All right, so hopefully this is the project that we left off of last time, and last time I think we just drew something on the screen and animated from a random position, and it moved +1 on the x-axis and +1 on the y-axis as well. So it should show, it should move diagonally right to the southeast of the screen. So let's see if this is this exact same project. All right, so we have this dude moving southeast. So this is the project we're looking for. And let's get started. So input manager should look like the scene manager here, but with a queue instead of just a list of items. And a queue is a data structure that is sort of like a list, but it's inserted and read in a specific order. When you insert something, it always insert at the very beginning, and when you read from it, it reads the very first one that you inserted. So basically, like a line that you might get into to see a movie. And in the programming world, we call this a FIFO, which is stands for first in, first out. All right, let's code this up, okay? So let's create a new C# class inside the share project. So I'll actually go here. All right, so we're gonna add it a new class called input manager, and that looks correct. We would want to change the namespace first to reflect the rest of the project, and we can make a static input manager because there's should be only one. Let's close this down. We don't need those images anymore, and we don't need my keyword test file. All right, so first thing to do is create a queue for the input manager, create a generic input item to insert into manager, a update function such that each time it is called, it returns the current input item, an add function to add an input item into the queue. What else do we need here? I think that's about it. So well, to create a queue for the input manager, we need to actually have a generic input first. So we have to add a generic input, and so we have to create a generic input. So let's just do that, and I'm just going to put it in here because just to save time, but in the future you might want to separate this into a separate file. So we'll call this generic input. All right, to do what can we add into such a generic input, right? Well, we probably want it a name for the input, right? And what target scene, maybe like a specific scene it should target as well, maybe, and maybe a target item. But this is just a generic input that other inputs is going to be derived from. So in name, should be something like that, right? And then let's create a constructor here. I think it's like this. All right. It's not name equals name. That's pretty good. A target scene. We're just gonna put a property for that, and maybe a target item. We probably won't use this, and it's for the future. So that's a nice generic generic input. Now, what I want to do now is create the queue for the input manager, and each of the queue items will be this generic input here, right? So a queue is I think it's just a queue, right? Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So okay, so it's just a queue of generic input. Let's call this input queue here, and create it off the bat. Now I don't want anybody to access this, so I'm gonna create it as a private queue. Alright, so there we go. Now we create a input for the, we created a queue for the input manager. That's done. Then we created a generic item to insert to the manager. That's done. Now let's add a function to add input into the queue. That's fine. We'll add input item, and we'll call this GI here, right? So remember, back to the picture, is that we need a locking mechanism each time we access the queue. Now in C#, how you do that is we just create a lock, which is basically a object. So private object input queue lock here, new object. So this will create a lock, and how to lock it is basically we call lock with our object here. So what happens is every single time this function is called, anything in between in the lock statement is only you can think of it as it only runs on a single thread, and any other threads trying to access this specific function has to wait until it exits out of the lock, right? So first we have to figure out the count of the queue. Okay. So count before add equals that. And then we lock the queue. Then we need to insert the generic input into the queue. So that would be in queue, which is basically your add, and then we just pass it the GI. Now we've figured out the count after the add. And then we determine if the add was successful by checking the count that is greater than the before. There we go. That's the whole thing. That's the add. Now we have to create a update function such that each time it is called, it returns the current input item. That's just the opposite of add. So we just go has to return a generic input update, and we don't have to actually pass the time for the time being, like this. Of course, we have to lock the input again. And then we just return the input queue dot dequeue here. And I think this returns null if there's nothing in it. So let's put a note. Alright. Alright, so there we go. That was fairly simple, wasn't it? Now that we've done that, we have to incorporate this inside our gaming loop. Now, got a generic input manager. Alright, now let's take a look at this code again. So we got generic input and then input manager. I think I'm forgetting something here. Let's check the scene manager. Scene manager for the template here. Oh, okay, that's what I forgot. A static, because I want to make this similar to a singletron. So there we go. Let's see if it compiles still. Okay. I have to make this static as well. Oops. And maybe this as well. Alright, so we must static everything. Alright, so that compiles, and like I said before, we need to incorporate this input manager into the gaming loop, which is practically just this game timer, if we remember correctly. And in the update, it pops out the current delta t, and then it passes to the current scene and with the delta time. So what we need to do is also pass it the current item as well. So let's do that. So get the current item from the input queue, input manager. So we got generic input gi equals input manager update. This will get the current input item, and then we just pass it onto the scene. Now we have to update the scene functions to accept the generic input item as well, and as a consequence we also have to update the generic item to receive that as well. So go in generic scene here and just add it into the list. Of course, we'll update that later. Looks like we can't name it GI because we already have a thing called GI in the thing. So let's just call it input. And of course, we have to update each item here as input as well. Let's go to generic item and do the same thing here. Input. And alright, so let's go this over one more time. We get the current input from the input manager, and then we update it with the delta time that has passed, and pass it along with the GI, which is the current input. And in the scene, we do the exact same thing, and we pass the current input to each of the items inside the scene. Alright, so I errored out, and this is good because I put a note here and I said I think it's null, and it errors out with a invalid operation because the queue is empty. Now we need to, I guess we need to check to see that, and then if it is empty, then return null, right? Okay, let's do that then. Alright, it doesn't have a nice empty function, but you can still get it by checking to see if the count is 0. If the count is 0, then we return null, else we return the current item. Now this shouldn't cause error. There we go. Now it's just waiting for us to get input. So what we're going to do now is add in an event handler such that when we move the mouse around or click on a button, it gets inserted into the queue. Okay, so next time we'll do that and end the episode right here.